Good evening, everyone. This is Les Smith. I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 6th in a series of MPART Pfas Regional Informational Webinars. This one specifically is for the Grand Rapids region. Next slide. Just want to, before we get started with our first presenter tonight, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping rules for working in a Zoom webinar. All lines are muted for this webinar. And we are recording the webinar, so the recording will be available following this evening's broadcast. Next slide. If you have questions throughout this evening that you wish to ask any of our panelists, there's multiple ways to do so. You may enter a question in the question and answer box located in the Zoom question and answer box at the bottom of the screen. You also may electronically raise your hand by selecting the hand icon located at the bottom of the screen. And for individuals who have called in, who are listening to this evening's conversation, and we have at least one person doing so, if you wish to electronically raise your hand, you can select the star and the number 9 key on your phone. That will electronically raise your hand. We'll see it here, and we'll try to unmute you so that you can speak to one of our panelists. With that, I would like to introduce our first speaker of the hour, the director, Mr. Steve Sliver, Executive Director of the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. Steve, take it away.
All right, thank you, Les, and good evening, everybody. As Les said, I'm Steve Sliver, Executive Director of MPART, and I appreciate the opportunity just to give you a basic introduction to what we're doing to address PFAS across the state. If you can go to the next slide, please. So Michigan's taken a very deliberate approach to address PFAS contamination. We've got a multi-agency, multidisciplinary approach. And the organization is known as the Michigan's PFAS Action Response Team. It's an advisory body comprised of key state departments responsible for environmental and natural resources protection, agriculture, public health, airports, military installations, and, and fire departments. And it leads all state efforts, coordination and cooperation among all levels of government as well on everything that we do with PFAS. And it's really the reason Michigan has been so successful at rapidly identifying and reducing exposures to PFAS with our data-driven and science-based approach. Next slide, please. So what are these compounds? Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, there's over 5,000 of them. And one thing that they all share in common is a really strong carbon-fluorine bond, one of the strongest bonds in chemistry. They're surfactants. They act as detergents and wetting agents, emulsifiers, foaming agents. They like to behave at the interface between media. And they repel water, oil, fats, and grease. Now, some of these have been around a long time, and others are being developed probably as we speak. And a key takeaway here is that they're not all the same. They don't all have the exact same structure, and they don't all behave in the environment the same way. Next slide, please. And it's always easier to talk where PFAS are not used rather than where they are, because they're used in so many things and so many industries and so many products, like water repellent clothing and stain resistant carpeting. The foams used petroleum fires and in food packaging and in industrial settings like in metal platers. Next slide, please. So why are we concerned about them? Well, as I mentioned, they're so widespread with so many uses. They've been around a long time. We're starting to find them that they aren't breaking down in the environment because of that really strong carbon-fluorine bond. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them are shown to be accumulating in our bodies. And as Bill will talk in a few minutes, some of them are known to affect health. They've been associated with adverse health effects. And really, we don't have all the information we'd like to have about these compounds yet, and don't have a strong regulatory structure at the national level. Next slide, please. this slide really illustrates how we are cycling PFAS throughout our ecosystem because we're not breaking them down or sequestering them. The landfill is a really good example because of all of those consumer products and industrial waste that ultimately end up in that landfill release PFAS into the leachate. That leachate often is not treated for PFAS, and so it goes on to the wastewater treatment plant that doesn't treat for PFAS either. And so the PFAS can pass into our rivers and streams and lakes, affecting drinking water sources and fish that we might consume. Some of the PFAS are known to accumulate in the wastewater treatment plant sludges, and some of those sludges could actually go back to the landfill or be land applied as biosolids to agricultural fields, impacting soils, groundwater, surface water runoff, and maybe even crops. And so our challenge is really to understand the presence, the occurrence of PFAS throughout this ecosystem so that we can break the cycle and protect public health. Next slide, please. And so Michigan is taking action to protect the public's water, and we're doing that in our surface water investigations where we have integrated PFAS and analysis into the surface water surveys and surveys of fish. This helps us track down sources of PFAS contamination when we find higher levels than what we're finding elsewhere in the state. We found high concentrations of PFAS in foam generated on surface water that are impacted by PFAS. So when we see foam, that helps us direct additional studies. And we have integrated PFAS into our wastewater programs. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, we've got, I had the wrong slide there, I apologize. But basically what I wanted to say was that with the surface water programs, the wastewater treatment plants have been asked to go back and look at upstream at their industrial users to identify the sources of PFAS contamination before they get to the headworks of that wastewater treatment plant. And it has had great success in adding pre-treatment to reduce or eliminate those sources. But this slide here is all about public water supply testing, where we began a couple of years ago to test all of our public water supplies to get a better understanding of the presence of PFAS throughout the drinking water for over 75% of Michigan's population. And we've been adding additional supplies as we've gone along and to better understand whether levels might fluctuate, and especially in the surface water systems. And next slide, please. And this is probably an oversimplification, but it gets the point across of the results that we found from testing the public water supplies is that basically 90% of them didn't have reportable concentrations of PFAS. And when I say that, that's 14 compounds in the EPA method that we used during the public water supply testing. If you added all of those up, none of them were reportable. We had another 7% though, when you add those up, where we had less than 10 parts per, less than 10 parts per trillion of total PFAS. Now that wasn't a level that we decided needed to be anything else done other than continue to monitor to see if it changes over time and make sure that the consumers of those public water systems were aware. But we did have 3% with something more than 10 parts per trillion of those total PFAS compounds. And those are the ones that we have been monitoring over time and told the supplies to start looking at whether or not there might be something they need to add for treatment, where there might be some potential sources of contamination in the area. And again, make sure that their customers are aware. Next slide, please. Now, we went to a science advisory panel back in 2018 and asked them about PFAS in drinking water. And we were using a 70 parts per trillion recommendation, a standard that came out of EPA as a lifetime health advisory. And that's, again, how we were kind of basing our recommendations to public water supplies. They told us then that 70 parts per trillion was probably not low enough for PFOA and PFOS, and that we should be looking at other compounds as well. Now, we found PFAS in some of our systems, and we typically look at EPA to establish a standard that we can adopt so that we can have ongoing monitoring and basically operationalize PFAS testing into our systems. And without any federal standards on the horizon, Michigan took the approach of going to a group of scientists and asking them which of the PFAS out there today should we be establishing drinking water standards for. And then Eagle promulgated standards and rule. Next slide, please. And here are the standards that just took effect on August 3rd. A couple of things I wanted to point out to you: that 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS, that the standards that came out of our process are 8 and 16, and considerably lower than that 70 parts per trillion. And also note that the levels are anywhere from 6 parts per trillion for PFNA to 400,000 parts per trillion for PFHXA. Again, indicating that these compounds don't all behave the same. Next slide, please. But one of the things that we've got to remember is that these drinking water standards aren't cleanup criteria, but promulgation of them did impact 2 criteria that we had. We had standards for PFOA and PFOS at 70 parts per trillion in any combination. Those by rule, by the effective rule, automatically became 8 and 16 parts per trillion on August 3rd. But the other 5 PFAS compounds, those need to go through a rulemaking process before they could be enforceable groundwater cleanup criteria in Michigan. And that is important for how we define a PFAS site. If you go to the next slide, please. So on August 3rd, our universe of sites expanded overnight from 99 to 138 because we define a PFAS site as a site that exceeds our groundwater cleanup criteria. So we have 100, and today actually 148 of those, and that's because our investigations are continuing across the state. And you've heard that we have contamination, a lot of contamination in Michigan. But it's not that we have more contamination than any other state. It's really that Michigan is looking more aggressively than any other state in the country right now. We're looking at areas based upon whether or not we think PFAS could be there, and most importantly, if it is, whether or not it could impact drinking water supplies off-site. That's how we've prioritized our work. The objective is to protect public health first and foremost. These are, landfills, industrial sites, military installations, and airports. And the work continues. We've got, hundreds of more investigations underway, some of which may lead to additional PFAS sites. Next slide, please. And it's important to note that if we find a location that we feel could impact drinking water off-site, especially private residential wells, is that we reach out to the community and make sure that, and through town halls like this and other venues, to make sure that everybody understands what we know, what we don't know, what our next steps are, and what the results of those investigations might be. We think we do a pretty good job at it, but we wanted to make sure that, that we're getting input on how we're doing. And so MPART established a citizens advisory work group. These are residents from impacted communities that are asked to advise us on how to better engage and empower communities that have been impacted by contamination, and as well as how to better educate the general public on PFAS and the work of MPART. Anybody interested in being on this work group just needs to go to the MPART website. The URL is shared at the end of these presentations, and go under the MPART tab and advisory groups, click on the Citizens Advisory Work Group, and there's a registration form and a charter. This group meets on second Tuesday of every month in the evening. Has been meeting remotely since it began, since these residents are from all across the state. And I'm really encouraged by their leadership and interest in helping MPART better engage communities. Next slide, please. So now we'll turn it over to Bill to talk a little bit about PFAS and health.
Thanks, Steve. Good evening, everybody. My name is Bill Farrell. I'm a toxicologist with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the role both the state and local health departments in the investigation of these PFAS sites, and then talk a little bit about our current understanding of the toxicology of these PFAS chemicals. Next slide, please, Heidi. Now, what the role of MDHHS in local public health? First of all, we want to try and understand the health concerns facing your community. We work with EGLE, which is the lead investigatory agency. We work with EGLE to develop plans to investigate and address the health risk at these sites. EGLE takes the lead in the site investigations, and MDHHS and local health departments provide the public health response. So we get involved in leading the public health planning and response activities. And we evaluate PFAS exposures to residents in the community. And based on the levels of exposures, we recommend public health actions as needed. Next slide, please. Now, how can I be exposed to PFAS chemicals? The main route of exposure is through ingestion of contaminated water that contains PFAS chemicals. Also could be exposed, as Steve mentioned, PFAS chemicals bioaccumulate in not only humans, but also wildlife. The state agencies evaluate PFAS levels in fish fillets, along with other chemicals, and issue fish consumption advisories as needed. And these fish consumption advisories could include do not eat fish consumption advisories if the PFAS levels or other chemicals levels are high enough in the fish. Also, you could be exposed to PFAS through incidental swallowing of contaminated soil or dust, eating food packaged in materials containing PFAS, consumer products, some consumer products historically have contained PFAS chemicals. And PFAS absorption through the skin is typically not a concern because these chemicals are not easily absorbed through the skin. Next slide, please. Now this slide, I just want to talk about PFAS levels have been measured in the population of the United States. As you've heard before, PFAS chemicals are used in all kinds of industrial applications, consumer products, and people, when they're exposed to PFAS chemicals, these PFAS are taken into the body and they are actually picked up or bind to proteins in the blood. So because everybody has been exposed to PFAS historically in all kinds of different products and stuff, everybody in the US and actually in the world has certain levels of PFAS, concentrations of PFAS in their blood. And this particular slide shows the levels of PFAS, certain PFAS chemicals that have been measured in individuals in the United States since 2000. Basically they started measuring PFAS levels in people's blood in 2000 as part of a study that's been that's been ongoing by CDC for years, basically where they look at the nutritional habits of people in the United States. And as part of that study, they also measure certain chemicals that can bioaccumulate in humans. And in 2000, they started measuring the levels of PFAS in the blood of people in the United States. And the interesting to note about this particular figure is that if you look at 2000, you see the top line, which is a particular PFAS chemical, PFOS. And you see that the average concentration of PFOS in people's blood in the United States in 2000 was about 30 micrograms per liter, or 30 parts per billion. And then as you see in succeeding years, you see that the levels had declined for PFOS, whereas 2014, the average concentration of PFOS in people's blood is about 6 parts per billion. And the reason for that is that in 2002, the United States banned the manufacture and use of two particular PFAS chemicals, PFOS and PFOA, in products that were manufactured in the United States. So as a result of banning the use and manufacture of those particular PFAS chemicals that's manufactured in the United States, you saw a corresponding decrease in exposure to those particular PFAS. And that's reflected in this slide with the decreasing concentrations of these PFAS chemicals over time since 2000. Next slide, please. Now, what do we know about the adverse health effects associated with PFAS exposures? Adverse health effects have been established in epidemiological and animal studies for some PFAS chemicals. This slide shows some of the adverse health effects that have been identified in humans associated with exposure to high levels of PFOS in epidemiological studies. And this slide shows specific adverse health effects from studies of two specific PFAS, PFOA and PFOS. These are the two PFAS that historically have been studied the most. And some of these adverse health effects include lowering a woman's chance of getting pregnant, increasing the chance of high blood pressure in pregnant women, increasing the chance of thyroid disease, increasing cholesterol levels, changing immune response, and increasing chance of cancer, particularly two specific cancers, kidney and testicular cancer. So with that, that's my presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Heidi.
All right, thanks, Bill. My name is Heidi Hellenbach. I am the Grand Rapids District Supervisor for the Air Quality Division in the Grand Rapids District Office with Eagle. I am also the PFAS Regional Team Lead for the Grand Rapids region. And the Grand Rapids region covers the same area as the Grand Rapids District, and it can be seen here on this map, comprised of 9 counties, and we are in the western part of the state along the lake. This map shows locations of 6 new Pfas sites that are a result of the new MCLs and cleanup criteria for PFOA and PFOS. And we will be talking about each of those sites. The sites on this list: CES Landfill of Hastings in Berry County. In Kent County, the Cedar Springs Historic Wastewater Treatment Lagoons and the current discharge fields, as well as the Steele Avenue area. And in Muskegon County, the former Teledyne Vehicle Systems, the Muskegon County Wastewater System, and the Muskegon Chemical Company. Now, each project manager for these sites will be giving a brief overview, summary of the site, data collected to date, and the steps moving forward. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Kent Walters to provide information on the CES landfill. Kent?
Thanks, Heidi. Hi, everyone. My name is Kent Walters. I am a geologist with the Materials Management Division of Eagle, and we help regulate landfills across Michigan. And I'm here to particularly talk about one landfill, CES landfill of Hastings. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar where this landfill is, this tan region here represents Berry County, and the black lines are state highways. The dots are major civilized areas, and you can see the red star there is the landfill we're talking about. It's just north, located just north of the city of Hastings. Next slide, please. So if we zoom into the site, we have an aerial, and we can see the landfill here is right smack dab in the middle of the image here. The white line represents the property boundary. The red line indicates areas where there has been waste placed or currently waste is being placed in. And we can see M43, Michigan Highway, M43 to the east, and Willits Road to the north. Next slide, please. So why did Eagle test for PFAS at this site? Well, a lot of landfills through Michigan have gone through a long regulatory history. So back for some landfills, it was common practice for waste to be placed in an area in line. And as time has progressed, there's increasing regulations that require landfills to put various types of landfill liners. So we can see sort of the progression through this landfill as well. The red area highlighted, they're unlined, meaning that there are there is no liner underneath the waste. But in other areas, there's clay liners. There's a mixture with, 2 clay liners. I'll call it a plastic with a clay liner, and then the majority of the landfill is a more modern engineered design, which is a double-lined system, which is basically 2 liners stacked on top of each other to help collect liquids that percolate through landfill waste, and that liquid can be collected and properly disposed of. Because we have these 2 areas I've highlighted that are unlined, there's potential for that the landfill is more modest, stacked on top of each other to help collect. We have these 2 areas that pass through the waste and percolate through. And that potentially could leave some chemicals that get into the groundwater and may migrate away from the landfill. Next slide, please.
Kent,
Yes.
you're kind of breaking up. Maybe you should turn your video off to see if that helps.
Yes,
Sure.
we agree. It's nice to see you, but it's just the audio kind of went bad when you turned the camera on. So.
Okay, if I need to review anything, let me know. If this is any better. Hopefully it is. Like I was saying, there's potential for contaminants to leak out of the landfill and into the groundwater. And that being said, there has been some historical impact from this landfill at this site. In response to that, there's been a whole bunch of groundwater monitoring wells that are installed down gradient of the landfill. And you can see all those monitoring wells with the orange and white checkered dots. And you can also, we also know the direction of groundwater flow at the site. You can see by those blue arrows, groundwater basically flows to the southwest of the site. Can you actually go back to the other side quick, Heidi? No, that's fine. Well,
Yeah. Not sure what happened.
that's fine. I can just pick it up from here. What did we find in the groundwater when we tested for PFAS? Looking at the map to the right, we have the site map, and then we have some colored dots that represent some different detections. And you can see at MW14 there's a red dot, and that indicates an exceedance. So we have PFOA. We had one detection of PFOA that was above criteria, and you can see how that's located right next to landfill. At MW12A, we had a detection of PFOA, but it was not above criteria. That's located just south of the landfill, a little bit further away. And then we had 3 locations that we tested that we did not detect PFAS. So you can see at MW27S, the furthest down gradient and furthest away from the landfill, we did not detect PFAS. At MW29S, the side gradient of the landfill, did not detect PFAS, and then MW3R is up gradient, and we didn't detect PFAS there either. What do these results mean? Well, if you look at MW29S, you can see there wasn't any detection of PFAS, but you also see these blue bullseye shapes on the map, and those indicate locations where there's homes and private drinking water wells. And so we sampled MW29S and we didn't find any PFAS. So that gives us good confidence that there's no PFAS in that region that would indicate that there's potential for any impacts to drinking water wells. We also found the southwest, so that means that PFAS that leaks out of landfill is likely flowing in the direction of groundwater flow. So we won't have any reason to suspect that the PFAS we see at MW14 is flowing straight east. We know that it's more likely flowing to the southwest away from receptors. And we also see PFAS decreasing as we go away from the landfill. So it's an exceedance right next to landfill, but it's a little bit lower the further you get away. And then once you get to MW27S, we don't see confidence that there's PFAS in the groundwater, but it doesn't appear to be given the information that we know at this point. So what are the next steps that we have for this site? Well, we need to do some additional on-site groundwater testing. We know there's groundwater impacted with PFAS above criteria, so we need to get a better handle on exactly where the impacts to groundwater are, and how wide it is, how long it is, and that information. So some more testing is needed. We don't have any private well testing planned at this time with the current information that we have. But that could change in the future. Like I said, more testing is needed at the site, and if we find information on site that would indicate we need to test public water systems or water supplies, then that's the direction we'll go. But like I said, there's not any information that, if we find, indicates that at this point. So that's the end of my presentation, and I will pass it off to the next presenter, Karen.
Thanks, Ken. Hopefully you guys can see and hear me okay. And if my video gets choppy like Kent's, let me know and I'll turn my video off for you. All right, next slide, Heidi.
It is not advancing.
Uh-oh. My presentation will be much better with slides.
Heidi?
There we go.
Oh, there you go.
We're good. That's okay. So again, yeah, my name's Karen Vorse, and I'm a project manager here in the Remediation and Redevelopment Division of Eagle in Grand Rapids. And I am the site lead for the Cedar Springs area investigation of the historic wastewater treatment lagoons and the current discharge fields. On the slide is my contact information. If anyone has any questions for me after the presentation that we can't answer, didn't get to, you can give me a call on my work cell phone, which is 616-439-8008, or you can email me, and that's vorcek, V-O-R-C-E-K @michigan.gov. All right, next slide, hopefully. So on the next slide, we're gonna get into a little bit just kind of the background of the Cedar Springs Historic Wastewater Treatment Lagoon site, and then also the current discharge fields. So it kind of can get a little bit confusing because it is two different sites, but it's all together in Cedar Springs. And I'm still seeing the first slide. There we go. So the historic lagoon property's address is 725 through 755 West Street, Northeast in Cedar Springs, and that's shown right there just north of 16 Mile, just to the east of US 131, highlighted in the light blue. Those are the historic treatment lagoons. And then the current discharge field for the wastewater treatment plant is located on Indian Lakes Road, right there, 4482 and 4550 Indian Lakes Road. And the historic lagoon property consists of roughly 45-acre wastewater lagoon system that operated from about 1965 to 1999. And that lagoon system was closed in place. And since 1999, the city has been using after treatment through a groundwater discharge permit, the current discharge fields on Indian Lakes, just to the south. Just still east of US 131, but just on the south side of Indian Lakes Road and just to the west of Northland Drive. Groundwater in the area, of course, we have different aquifers flowing in different directions from what we can tell. The shallower groundwater flows more in a west-southwest direction with influence from Little Cedar Creek at the current discharge fields, and then Cedar Creek itself up at the historic wastewater treatment. And then the deeper groundwater is inferred or believed to flow more in the regional southern flow. Next slide, please. So this site's a little bit, has a little bit longer history that we've been trying to keep an eye on and get some investigation going and dealing with residents. I don't know if you all remember, but back in 2017 and 2018, PFAS was a pretty hot topic. here in West Michigan due to the Wolverine Worldwide investigations in North Kent County. And out of that, a lot of people in just the overall North Kent County and many townships and many communities wanted to test their private drinking water wells for PFAS. And so during that time, we had residents in this area sample their well for PFAS, and 16 of those residents shared their results with Eagle. At that time, the highest result of those 16 samples was 18.2 parts per trillion for PFOA, below our then 70 parts per trillion groundwater standard for PFOA and PFOS. And so as those results were coming in, we kind of were wondering, where are we getting, where's this PFAS coming from? There is a number of houses that have this kind of lower level PFOA. So we went out in 2019 and resampled 7 of those wells just to verify with our consultant and our lab and a chain of custody to verify that that PFOA that we were seeing was indeed there. And sure enough, our results did replicate the individual homeowner results. And the highest result from that was 15 parts per trillion for PFOA, again below the then 70 parts per trillion cleanup criteria. However, Eagle staff, especially in our remediation and redevelopment division, still, we're doing some desktop reviews and historical research to try to figure out what could be potentially, causing this low level PFAS contamination in the neighborhood. And so during our review of property uses in the area, we did notice that there was the historic wastewater treatment lagoon property, and then the current wastewater treatment discharge fields in the area, which may have been a potential source for this. So next slide. And so, we reached out to the city of Cedar Springs and explained, that we think it could be a potential. We don't know for sure. And so they agreed to conduct some sampling of their on-site environmental monitoring wells. 5 monitoring wells at the historic lagoon property up by 16 Mile, and then 4 monitoring wells at the current discharge fields. Those are groundwater monitoring wells that they use as part of their current permit that they have at the discharge fields and historical work at the lagoons that were existing. So they were able just to go out and add PFAS onto their normal routine monitoring that they do. And it's important to understand how PFAS, we'll get to the results, but why would there even be PFAS at these? What made us think this could be a potential source is that if you think about it, wastewater treatment facilities, they receive waste from both industrial, commercial, non-commercial, residential users. And historically, before we started our statewide testing and helping, a lot of industry, test for PFAS, PFAS was not sampled for, it wasn't on anyone's radar. And so wastewater treatment plants were not built with, special filtration for PFAS and whatnot. So anything that's coming in that has PFAS is likely going to be then discharged going out after treatment. And so all of the waste streams coming into the wastewater treatment plant could have, like Steve talked about in the beginning, many uses, so many sources that could be coming in. However, we weren't seeing extremely high levels of PFAS. They were, a little bit lower, more diluted. And so the 5 monitoring wells at the historic lagoon property, 4 of the 5 did contain PFOA above 8 parts per trillion, nothing above the criteria at the time in January 2020, but it did exceed the proposed criteria and now the new cleanup criteria. It had a detection of 43 parts per trillion was the highest result at the historic lagoon property. And then moving to the current discharge fields, 4 wells were sampled there and 1 monitoring well had an exceedance of the 8 parts per trillion of PFOA with a concentration of 10 parts per trillion. So next slide, please. And so this figure is also on our MPART website for this site in particular, so you can look at it in more detail at your leisure. I tried to enlarge it as best I could. So what you'll see on here are the little circles are the residential well sampling results, which have been sampled to date by Eagle. The triangles are the environmental monitoring wells I talked about earlier. If you look to the north, outlined in blue are the historic lagoons and the triangles around there. And then kind of more in the middle with the gray dashed outline is the current discharge field areas. And you'll see the triangles around there that were sampled, highlighted in colors. And so what the colors mean is anything green means that it did not have PFOA or PFOS detected, so it was not detect for those two chemicals. A yellow means that it was detected, but it's below our criteria of 8 for PFOA or 16 for PFOS. And a red indicates that it exceeds that criteria of 8 or 16. So based on the groundwater sampling data that Cedar Springs obtained, we did have PFAS, not extremely high levels, but it still was there above the incoming cleanup criteria that we knew was probably going to be passed at some point this year. So we went ahead and got some state funding to go out and sample additional residential wells in the area. We reviewed area geology, well depth, location to the potential sources, and selected 54 properties to start out an initial well sampling to see if we have a area-wide issue. Was it more isolated? What are we dealing with? So we sent letters out to residents, and some residents we've sent 2 letters and left door hangers, some outreach. And to date, 38 residents responded. 38 out of the 54 have responded for sampling. And you'll see, if you count the dots, that we have 12 red circles. So 12 properties exceed the criteria. Highest result in a residential well is 16 parts per trillion for PFOA. 10 of those dots are going to be yellow, and those are detections of PFOA or PFOS, but again, below the standard. And then 23 of those dots, the circles, are non-detect, meaning PFOA and PFOS were not detected. So this map will be updated as more sampling is done. And the same goes for the environmental sampling on site, those triangles. As more sampling is done and more of those triangles are sampled over time, we'll be updating this figure to show that. And to date, if you add up the 7 wells we sampled in 2019 and then the 38 that we've sampled this summer, we're up to 45 residential wells to date in the area. Next slide, please. So the next steps here is we'll continue to review the sampling data and the geology as we look at the well logs and determine which houses are going to be part of the next round of sampling. So we'll be working on that. We have been working on that the last couple of weeks, so we anticipate additional letters will be going out to residents in the next couple of weeks, requesting access for our subcontractor, our state contractor, to sample. So we'll be getting more data that way. The local health department, Kent County Health Department, and the state health departments will continue working with area residents to provide them their point of use filters based on their well results if they require one. Also, the health departments provide residents with their results. So they give the residents a call and explain the results to them and then mail them the hard copy in the mail. So they'll continue supporting us in that. And then our Water Resource Division will work with the City of Cedar Springs itself regarding the on-site investigations of the historic lagoon property and then the current discharge fields, as those are still, kind of potential sources that need further investigation and more understanding. So again, as investigation goes on, we'll be updating our website, and feel free to reach out to me anytime you have a question. And now I'll turn it on to the next presenter, to Jay Pohl.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Karen, for the introduction there. Good evening, everybody. Like she said, my name is Jay Pohl, and I'm a project manager, geologist, and environmental quality analyst here at the Grand Rapids District Office. My primary area of concern is Southern Kent County, and I work in a Part 201 environmental remediation program, along with Karen and others in the office there. I'm here to present the Steele Avenue area investigation for you. Next slide, please. Currently, the investigation is focused around the 1500 block of Steele Avenue in southwestern Grand Rapids. That's south of Hall Street and east of the US 131 corridor, if you're familiar with that area. The property that cued us into this condition had been vacant and undeveloped for as far back as it was researched. It was briefly used to store some landscaping materials and brush prior to the investigation, but otherwise not developed. So before the current owners purchased the property back in 2019, they did some soil and groundwater sampling and discovered that PFAS was present in all 5 of the groundwater samples that they collected out there. They also detected chlorinated solvents and some fuel oil contaminants, which have been detected elsewhere in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. So if you look closely there, those blue dots represent the temporary wells that were installed to collect those groundwater samples that I mentioned. The consultant's rationale for sampling out here was the known presence of various contamination in the ground at other locations nearby. Groundwater out here is at a depth of about 15 feet, and it's likely flowing in a westerly direction, ultimately towards Plaster Creek, which is off this picture to the west or the left side. The narrow blue line on this slide represents the Silver Creek drain, which is an underground drain that wraps around the investigation area. It likely has some effect on groundwater flow through the area, but we need more information to understand it better. As you can see, the area is pretty industrial, with factories to the north and east, and a railroad switching yard to the west there. To the south and west of 131, you can also see some residential homes. But this area, thankfully, is entirely on city water, and we're not aware of any drinking water wells at this time. Next slide, please. So these are the results of the groundwater sampling that was conducted by the private party. Concentrations of PFOA range from 7.9 parts per trillion to 11 parts per trillion. And the concentrations of, that should see, PFOA ranged from 4.8 parts per trillion to 29 parts per trillion. The numbers in red represent exceedances of the new cleanup criteria. The data here starts to suggest that the source could be to the northeast of this property. Next slide, please. So this here is just a screen grab of Eagle's environmental mapper database, which you guys can log in and look up also by going to our website. Each of these dots represents a known site of contamination in the area. These dots represent a lot of different sites and many unrelated contaminants, but I wanted to show you that the investigation is in what we call a target-rich environment for potential sources. Next slide, please. Given all these potential sources, when funding permits, our next steps include additional file review to narrow down our list of likely sources or historical spills. We do have a couple of suspects based on the file information and anecdotes that we've heard out there, but we need to have evidence to tie this PFAS contamination to specific polluters or known sites of contamination. To get there, we're planning to conduct our own investigation to backtrack the contamination in the groundwater. As we learn more, we will continue to make sure nobody's drinking the water in our investigation area. If at any time we discover that someone may be drinking or otherwise using the impacted groundwater, we're going to work with our partners at DHHS to make sure that this stops and get them on another drinking water source or filters. If we do find a source, then of course we'll work to pursue compliance and enforcement activities in accordance with Part 201, which is our environmental law. And like Karen mentioned too, check back at the MPART website to follow the investigation as it goes along there. We'll be providing updates to the maps and so forth as we learn more and install some more wells. So next slide, please. I'm going to hand off the presentation here to my colleague, John Mccabe of the Materials Management Division to talk about Teledyne.
Thank you, Jay. As Jay said, my name is John Mccabe. I'm in the Materials Management Division, and I'm part of a project team that's been overseeing hazardous waste cleanup activities at this facility. My contact information is here, and you can view it after the webinar too. This webinar will be recorded. Next slide, please. Thank you, Heidi. The former Teledyne Vehicle Systems is located on the north side of Muskegon, in Muskegon County. You will notice the north branch of the Muskegon River just above the site. The site is outlined in white there, and 4 Mile Creek just below, just to the south of the site. This site has been a industrial operation, manufacturing parts for military vehicles since the early 1940s, late 1930s. PFAS contamination was originally discovered in pumped groundwater from this site, which was being discharged to the Muskegon County Wastewater system. The groundwater was being pumped to prevent off-site flow of previously identified solvent contamination. Cleanup activities up to the time PFAS had been discovered there focused primarily on chlorinated solvents that had been released to the groundwater at the site over the years. And the facility is actively pumping groundwater to keep it from exiting the site. So that was fortuitous in terms of controlling the spread of contamination from the facility. Residential wells have not been sampled as yet because we have a pretty good handle on the fact that contaminated groundwater isn't leaving the site. Next slide, please. PFAS concentrations at the site are summarized in this figure. Basically, a green triangle means PFAS was not detected at all. Purple triangle means PFOS was detected at greater than the 16 part per trillion cleanup criterion. And a red triangle indicates that PFOA was recorded at higher than the 8 part per trillion cleanup criterion. You can see that there are actually only three concentrations of PFOS and 1 concentration of PFOA that exceeded these criterion. Apparently a little bit of the slide was cut off, a little bit of the key at the bottom here. The orange triangles also represent detections of either PFOS or PFOA that were not above the criteria. Next slide, please. Okay, next steps at the facility. We have currently added PFAS monitoring to the site perimeter groundwater monitoring system to ensure that PFAS are not getting off the site in groundwater. We're going to continue and adjust and monitor the pumping well discharge to ensure that PFAS exceedances are not discharged to the Muskegon County wastewater system. And we're going to do some investigative work to better determine what PFAS distribution is on site, identify potential source areas, and make decisions based on that information. And that's basically it. And Tom Burdinsky is up next.
Hi, I'm Tom Burdinsky, and I'm in Eagle's Water Resources Division, and I'll be giving an overview of the Muskegon County Wastewater Management System Metro Wastewater Treatment Plant. Next slide. Muskegon County Wastewater Management System, I'm going to shorten up the name a little bit, is located at 698 North Maple Island Road in Muskegon County. It went into full operation in 1974. And this wastewater treatment plant treats most of the industrial and domestic wastewater generated in Muskegon County. And if you live in Muskegon County, it's pretty hard to miss this site. It's about 11,000 acres in size, and pretty much everyone knows where it is who's from Muskegon. Next slide. This wastewater treatment plant was designed to treat 42 million gallons of wastewater per day. Treatment includes aeration cells, aerated settling cells, storage lagoons, which you can see in this picture, those very large squarish figures in the middle, spray irrigation of the stabilized wastewater, under drains to collect the irrigation water, and interception ditches to collect site leakage for treatment by rapid infiltration basins. The interception ditch is kind of like a moat that surrounds the property and captures any kind of leakage, and we'll get into that a little bit later. The treated wastewater is discharged to the Muskegon River. Some of the wastewater discharges to the groundwater. So monitoring wells are installed within and surround the wastewater treatment plant to monitor the groundwater. Surface water and groundwater discharges are limited and monitored in accordance with a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit issued to the Muskegon County Board of Public Works by EGLE. Next slide. EGLE's Industrial Pretreatment Program PFAS initiative identified the Muskegon County Wastewater Management System as a site of concern due to the acceptance of potential PFAS containing waste streams, including leachate from the county-owned landfill, which is located on the southeast corner of the wastewater treatment site. It's kind of in the center of this picture here, but also from various industries and groundwater cleanups that were known or suspected to contain PFAS. The wastewater treatment plant does not produce PFAS, but PFAS are discharged into the system from these sources. Under the initiative, Muskegon County has been working with these sources to reduce PFAS discharge to the wastewater treatment plant and monitors its treated wastewater effluent regularly. The effluent results for PFOS have shown improvement under the initiative, with recent concentrations typically between 13 and 17 parts per trillion. The surface water discharge standard for PFOS is 12 parts per trillion. Muskegon County also performed internal in-plant sampling for PFAS. Due to detections of PFAS in the storage lagoons and in the interception ditches, EGLE required that Muskegon County sample a portion of the wastewater treatment plant's groundwater monitoring wells for PFAS. Go to the next slide. Of the 23 monitoring wells that were sampled, 3 exceeded the groundwater cleanup criteria of 16 parts per trillion for PFOS and 8 parts per trillion for PFOA that went into effect on August 3rd. The highest results from this effort was 48 parts per trillion of PFOS and 42 parts per trillion of PFOA, as shown in the table there. Go to the next slide. 2 of the 3 monitoring wells exceeding the criteria are located well within the 11,000-acre wastewater treatment plant site, between the site's 2 large storage lagoons. So if you look at this diagram here, that red dot kind of in the middle there, those 2 little red dots, that's where 2 of the wells were located that had exceedances. The 3rd monitoring well that exceeded criteria is located on the site's perimeter in the northwest corner, also in red. So if you look up kind of to the upper left-hand corner there, you'll see a red dot. This monitoring well on the site perimeter has PFOS of 9.3 and PFOA of 21 parts per trillion. Approximate groundwater flow direction, which is shown by the blue arrows, ranges from southwest and northwest underneath the storage lagoons. An interception ditch surrounds the storage lagoons and captures the shallow groundwater flow beneath these lagoons, kind of like a moat. Outside of the groundwater interception ditch, shallow groundwater flows back toward the interception ditches and the storage lagoons. A recent study performed by Muskegon County indicates that the groundwater flow direction at the monitoring well exceeding criteria in that northwest site perimeter is back toward the interception ditch, so away from potential receptors. Next slide. So to ensure the protection of public health, EGLE will work with the Muskegon County Wastewater and Muskegon County Health Department to conduct an evaluation of potential receptors. We'll also work with the Muskegon County Department of Public Works to determine the nature and extent of the plume, including the possibility of an off-site PFAS source. The evaluation of potential receptors and the plume study plan are expected to be developed this fall. And that's where we are at with this one. So next slide, I think I handed it off to Nick Dawson.
Hey, guys, this is Nick. I'm having a little trouble with the video, but can you guys hear me okay? Just want to make sure.
Yes, Nick, I can hear you great.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll charge forward without the video. Sorry about that, but I can't get that to work. My name is Nick Dawson. I am part of the Remediation and Redevelopment Division and Superfund section, and I am the project manager for Muskegon Chemical Company. Next slide, please. Location of Muskegon Chemical Company is 1725 Warner Street, City of Whitehall, in Muskegon County. This site is a Superfund site, and it's been on the National Priorities List since 1990. Next slide. So this map depicts the sites made up of 3 different properties. In the upper right, of course, you have the plant property outlined in red. This is where the former Muskegon Chemical Company's plant was, hence the name. On the inside, on the lower right, you can see in purple, and that's where the plant was positioned on the property. To the left, you have the Housekeeping property. This is a light industrial area. The Housekeeping property is owned by the Housekeeping Corporation. And then to the lower left, you have the Mill Pond Creek property. This is 88 acres of undeveloped land, heavily wooded, and the Mill Pond Creek itself runs through the property. Next slide. So how did the Muskegon Chemical Company come to be sampled for PFAS, and why is it on the MPART? Through evaluation of the site, Eagle determined that PFAS needed to be sampled because of the activities on the site and chemicals used. We requested the responsible party, which is the Flint Hills Resources Group, to sample for PFAS, and that occurred in October of 2018. So they sampled 6 monitoring wells on site, and through that, the results showed that there's analytes that were detected, but they were below the criteria for the time. So they were below any drinking water, 70 parts per trillion at the time. So if you fast forward to the new criteria that is adopted in August 3rd of 2020, we reviewed the data, and we found that 2 of those 6 wells were above criteria for the new MCLs. Next slide. So this is a more zoomed in look at the plant property. What we see is the blue and white circles depict the 6 monitoring wells that were sampled for PFAS back in 2018. The red dots are next to the wells that exceed the new MCL for PFOA, which is 8 parts per trillion. So we have the KCC22S, which is the farthest red dot to the north there. That is at 18 parts per trillion. And then the next one down from that is KCC34, that is 12 parts per trillion. So those are 2 exceedances on the site. Next slide, please. This figure gives an overview of where the groundwater flow is going in the area. So again, we're looking at the plant property in the upper right corner of the map, and the groundwater flow is to the southwest, so it's going towards the Mill Pond Creek property and through the Housekeeping property. Next slide. So what are the next steps? Since this is a Superfund site, you know, we cooperate with EPA on this. We're always talking with them on Superfund sites. We're also talking with the responsible party on the site, which is the Flint Hills Resources Group. So we're always discussing things, and especially with PFAS, the discussions are ongoing is what are the next steps going to be. One of the things that we'd like to see, for Eagle would like to see, is we'd like to see additional monitoring well sampling out there. We'd like for them to resample the 6 wells that were shown a couple slides ago, the map, and we also like to see additional numbers of monitoring wells so we can look at the full picture on the site out there to see what might be going on. In regards to residential well sampling, residential wells, residences are located, this is like I said, light industrial area, but the residences are located probably a half mile to a quarter mile south of the plant property. So that's directly south. We're looking at groundwater flow going to the southwest. So at this time, we've discussed this with the HHS and Muskegon County Health Department. We're not going to be looking to pursue residential well sampling. Now that could change in the future if once we do additional sampling out there of the monitoring well network, but at this time, we're not going to be pursuing that. So for me, that is it, and I'll be turning this back over to Heidi Hollenbeck. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for the site overviews. This slide depicts all of the site leads for the 6 new sites we just discussed. Names, phone numbers, and email addresses. So if you want to jot something down real quickly. Otherwise, as Les said at the beginning, this is being recorded and you can go back and access this information. This is a listing of the local health departments in the Grand Rapids region. And they would be the best contacts for you if you have health-related questions. So you can jot down any relevant number. And with that, we are going to take questions. Along with the panelists, we do have some other Eagle experts, and as well as representative from Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development and Department of Natural Resources. So if you've got questions, we hopefully will have answers. So Les, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right, thank you, Heidi. Thank you to Steve and all the panelists this evening. To our attendees, we do apologize for some of the connectivity issues. You know, when we have these webinars, connectivity is kind of an unpredictable thing, and we hope that you please accept our, we do hear you and we do understand, and we're trying to work through those. So we do have a couple of questions. I just want to remind everyone that if you would like to ask a question of anyone on the panel, you can type your questions in the question and answer box located at the bottom of the screen. You may electronically raise your hand, selecting the hand icon. We do have at least one person on the phone. So if you're listening by phone and have a question for any of the presenters tonight, you can select the star and the number 9 keys to electronically raise your hand, and we will try to unmute your mic so you can talk to the panel. While we're waiting for questions to come in, we do have a couple of questions that have come in, and I would like to get those going out of the way here. So the first question of the evening goes to Karen. So Karen, if you could turn your camera on and your microphone, this one's for you.
All right.
In regards to the Cedar Springs wastewater lagoons and discharge fields, wouldn't they be required to meet the new surface water standards on site, or is it because they may be impacting the residential wells that they are required to meet the drinking water standards?
Okay, yeah, good question. So from my division standpoint, RRD, we're kind of heading up the receptor investigation specific to drinking water, so the residential wells and potential receptors of the drinking water pathway. The other pathway that you bring up, the surface water and or GSI, groundwater surface water interface, you know, is our different cleanup criteria that we do have as well, and that's going to be handled by our water resource division. They're going to be working with Cedar Springs to meet any of their permit requirements that they have at their current discharge fields or anything associated with the historical lagoon site. So with that just beginning, it might be a little premature to talk about any sort of treatment or long-term actions there, but they're definitely going to be starting that investigation and working with Cedar Springs and looking at what's all there. So hopefully that answers your question. You can contact me and I can get you in contact with the Water Resource Division staff person who's going to be overseeing that investigation. So maybe you can get a connection with them and they can keep you updated on what they're finding and things like that. So you can give me a call at 616-439-8008 and I can help you make that connection.
All right, thank you, Karen. There's one additional question in this question here, and it says here, if treatment is required in the future, what is anticipated for the former lagoons versus the current discharge fields and wastewater treatment plant?
Right, yeah, I think it is too soon to talk about treatment at those sites, just because we don't know the whole universe. We've only had 5 monitoring wells sampled at the Lagoon site, and then only 4 sampled at the current discharge field. So, and since it isn't my division taking the lead on that, I wouldn't want to put words in their mouth for them. So it's
Very
definitely
good.
an iterative approach to see, what next steps will be there.
Okay, thank you, Karen.
Mhm.
I'm remiss, I forgot to mention that I do have a co-host with me. Mr. Joel Roseberry is helping me navigate the questions behind the scenes. So the next question goes to Tom. Tom, if you wouldn't mind turning the camera on, unmute your mic. This one's for you. All right, Tom, this one's for you. Understanding that wastewater treatment plants are passive recipients of these chemicals, how are you engaging and regulating the sources that are contributing to the impacts at the wastewater treatment plants?
So under the Industrial Pretreatment Program PFAS initiative that I mentioned earlier, we identified 95 wastewater treatment plants in Michigan that were receiving industrial waste. And we required those wastewater treatment plants to perform an evaluation to determine if they were receiving PFAS from any of basically their industrial sources. And if they were receiving PFAS above a screening level, they were then required to engage these industrial sources and use existing industrial pretreatment program legal authorities to get the sources to develop plans to reduce the PFAS, maybe to install treatment, maybe to do some cleaning, maybe to reroute some discharge flows, things like that. Now, this it's basically it's a kind of a relationship between the wastewater treatment plant and the industrial sources. So they're engaging with the municipalities for the most part to come up with their own plans to reduce PFAS, and it's been a very successful approach. We've seen significant reduction in PFAS from numerous sources. We've had wastewater plants that were exceeding water quality standards in their effluent, and when they identified their most significant source and that source installed treatment, they're now in compliance with those water quality standards. So it's been a very successful approach.
Thank you. There was a second part of the question, Tom. I think you actually answered it already, and that's about the work that was done to track down the sources. Thank you. The next question is for the Steele Avenue site. All right, thanks, Jay.
All right, you got me.
Yes, thanks, Tom. Jay, this one's for you. The Steele Avenue site is a spot that a good friend and former roommate, okay. The question is, I know there's a building that started when that property got purchased. What type of sampling have you done of any of the food that might still be growing from that site? It's about a garden. It's a garden question.
Well, I'm not aware right now. Actually, that site has been redeveloped into a large either factory or industrial warehouse at this point. So I'm not aware of anything growing on that property, or at least anything growing out of the soil. So
actually, I'm sorry, Jay. The question, apparently in one of the photos concerning the site, there is a garden that's visible in the photos.
okay, well, that was actually those brush piles and chipped wood and so forth that was used by an adjacent landscaping company briefly for surface storage. So I'm not aware of any gardening that was done out there, just composting temporary storage of materials before they could get it chipped and shipped off site.
Okay, I'm gonna ask it a different way just to kind of close this one out. Has there been any sampling of any neighborhood gardens in the area in the vicinity of Steele Avenue?
No, not at this time.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jay. Okay. I think that one's been answered. Let's see. Next question is there cause for concern for the consumption of waterfowl for hunters at Muskegon County's wastewater site? maybe one of our other panelists could address this one, DNR or.
Yeah, this is Tammy Newcomb with the DNR. I'll
Thank you,
answer.
Tammy.
Yeah, you bet. So DNR has been working with our partners at DHHS and Eagle to look at the aspects of waterfowl sampling. And the answer is right now, we don't know. Part of the issue with waterfowl is that they are so migratory. So a bird that you sample in Lake A on day 1 may have spent less than 24 hours at that location and actually spent most of the summer someplace entirely different. So it's difficult to correlate contamination results in waterfowl to the water body that they're directly taken from because they move around so much. So right now we don't know. There's been other places that have sampled waterfowl immediately adjacent to some contamination sites, and one of those being the dioxin contamination site over in Saginaw. And part of that there is those waterfowl in that area do tend to be more residential over in that area. So we're working on that issue, but we don't have an answer right now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tammy. I have one other similar question. I'm not sure this one's for you, Tammy, but it may be for one of our other partners on the panelist team here. This concerns crops. Similar question as the one prior about waterfowl, but this one's about crops. Are there concern or cause for concern for consumption of crops that are growing at the Muskegon County wastewater site, particularly if wastewater is utilized for irrigation of crops?
This is Christine Kosmowski, and I'm with the Michigan Department of Ag and Rural Development. No crop sampling has been done at that site. It is an area that is not very well understood at this point as well. Within the state, just some preliminary sampling has occurred, and analysis actually is not complete at this point. So we don't really have a lot of information to share, and specifically about this site as well.
Okay, right, thank you. And the requester says, thank you for the 2 answers.
I could add a bit to that answer. Just concerning crop consumption at Muskegon County, the crops that are raised there are not raised to be consumed by humans directly, basically. They're crops that can be used for animal feed and things like that, but they have to go through a processing step. So it's not like you can buy the crops from, Muskegon County wastewater plant at a farmer's market or anything like that. They have certain, uses that they are allowed to be used for, but not direct consumption.
Okay, thank you, Tom. We don't have any new questions at the moment, but I wanted to check back, because we had some technical difficulties. I wondered if Kent, if you're there, Kent, can you just give us like a really quick summary of the site that you were presenting, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, I can do that. And I'm sort of stalling right now to see if my audio is coming in better. Is it coming in better now?
It sounds good right now. Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's odd. Of course, the only time I get audio issues is during something like this.
So if you wouldn't mind just giving us a summary of what you presented, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So, in a quick summary, I guess, and Heidi, I can see you're trying to get to a slide, and maybe that's all right. We don't need a slide. In quick summary is, the site, the Hastings landfill site, has had historic contamination at the site, which it basically was a good indication for us to try to look at the site to see if there's potential for any PFAS contamination, just because of its history. We know that a lot of waste that like Steve mentioned earlier, a lot of waste like you and I dispose of, they may contain PFAS in them. So there's reason to believe that there's potential for PFAS to go into the groundwater. So we tested for PFAS in the groundwater, and we found some. There was only one well that was above criteria. It didn't look like current information doesn't look like PFAS is moving too far away from the landfill, and it also indicates to us that we don't see it near any residential drinking water supplies. So that's all good news, but we do have some next steps that we are gonna try. We're gonna be sampling some additional on-site groundwaters wells to get a better handle on what's going on at the site now that we know that there's PFAS there. And we don't have any private well testing planned at this moment, but we definitely will, if information points us in that direction, we definitely will consider that if information from here on out tells us that. So I hopefully that came in clearer for everyone.
Yes, it did. Thank you, Kent. Thank you for bringing that summary back. I'm checking. I do not see any new questions for this evening. And we don't have any hands raised at the moment. Stalling a little bit. Heidi, could you bring back up the list of the contact information? I want to give those that are watching the webinar this evening, if you want to get your phones out and take a picture of the contact slide on the screen that has the contacts for the sites that were discussed this evening. Also, please, as a reminder, let you know that this is being recorded and that the website of the webinar recording will be posted on the MPART response page and also the Eagle YouTube channel as well. Okay, I think I've stalled long enough. I don't see any new questions. So it is now 7:21. It is my pleasure to, again, just say thank you all to all of you who have participated and stuck around with us for this evening's conversation. Hope that you learned a lot. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the contacts here on the screen. With that, I wish you all a good night. And that concludes tonight's webinar. Thank you all.